Super. Well, thank you, Megan. Thank you all for having me. My name is Dane Froese, like Megan mentioned. I'm a farmer and agronomist in south central Manitoba. I work as the oilseed specialist for Manitoba Agriculture. So you would have heard from my colleague John Hurd a few weeks back, and put together a couple comments and considerations here for Ontario growers. So I wanted to thank Megan and Sebastian for providing me some background info. I don't get out to Eastern Ontario very much, if at all, ever. I think I've been in the Ottawa airport once, so I flew over it. But with the help of the internet, we found some good information, and I'm going to bring some tips from a Manitoba perspective. So it's kind of take it as a good suggestion, but it's certainly not the gospel truth for what may be different in your scenario. So I wanted to talk about a couple different things. I grouped them into three groups: agronomy optimization, talking a little bit about seeding tools, agronomics for the best crop, emergence and success, managing trench, sidewall smear, depth, soil crusting, and then going on to a little bit more detailed examination of equipment optimization that we use on the prairies, some calibration, seed openers, closing wheels, and then looking at time, seeding in cold soils, seeding in a very quick hurry, and when you have a short seeding window, how to deal with frost and or heat blast when it comes later in the summer. So moving into the agronomy section, understanding soils and environment. Megan, I can't actually see the chat, so if you've got questions that pop up, if you wouldn't mind reading them out, that'd be great.
Yep, I'll jump in.
Super. Okay, with clay soils and canola, we see it that works really, really well on the prairies. Most of our soils are clayey, have a highly calcareous base. Canola emerges well. It's not a very fussy crop in that sense, as long as we maintain really good seed to soil contact. And it's not usually as much of a problem in clays as it might be in a loamy or a sandy soil, but crusting and compaction can actually more often be the issue than seed to soil contact. We know that higher soil organic matter, so SOM, helps with soil aggregation, and that soil organic matter, the bond between soil particles is less strong than if it was a clay on clay bond. So by having a slightly weaker bond, it holds particles together well, but it also is friable, breaks apart. So that really helps when we have soils that are have fairly poor structure and tend to collapse easy or tend to crust. We also know that having a trash-free seed row is really important to having good crop emergence. Canola being a small seed needs space to come up. Soil temperature is greater than 5 degrees Celsius. Less than that, canola doesn't want to emerge very well, or it takes a long time to come up. And we want to target a seed depth of 0.5 inch to 1.5 inches, generally no more. Even if it's really dry, don't seed deeper than that, chasing moisture. It just won't work out well. Okay. Now, what we do in Manitoba, most farmers in our province will, and in the Western Prairies actually, will seed into stubble or residue. We target 5 to 7 plants per square foot. I'm sure that's very similar in Ontario, and generally less than a 15-inch row spacing. So we're looking at canola typically most common on about a 10-inch spacing. Range is usually between 7.5 to about 12. So when we look at 15 inches, we're looking at planted canola or wide row canola. Not very common, but certainly an increasing trend where producers are looking at saving seed. We do know that spoked gauge wheels tend to be very important on the clay soils, especially as we get into muddier years. Spiked closing wheels really help. They provide a fracture point for seed emerging from a seed trench, especially if it gets very muddy, or we see that crusting tend to become a problem. Trash cleaners on heavy residue fields are ahead of that seed row, just allowing seed to go into the ground and not be hairpinned on the surface. Farmers will tend to prefer a single disc or an independent link hoe opener, followed by flex frame openers or flex frame hoe drill, and then slowing down. And I put that in bold because that's what we need to do on the prairies here too. We do tend to find growers pushing speed, especially when they have lots of acres to cover, and equipment manufacturers are all about selling equipment based on how fast you can get the job done. That's not something we really encourage with canola. You want to make sure that your seed is going in the ground, it's going in the ground well, it's tucked in there nicely. Racing along too fast, that seed tends to bounce out, blow out of the furrow, et cetera, et cetera. And with a small seed, you just don't have the luxury of being able to seed maybe as fast as you want. So slowing down and just doing a good job.
I wonder what that water is going to taste like in our cooler over there, like our fountain.
Okay. Talked a little bit about residue and how residue can impede emergence, hairpinning seed. The photo there we've got from a planted canola project that I had done in Manitoba in 2018. We'd looked at putting canola on wide row spacing, but the field was very, very heavy corn residue, corn trash. So I would expect that's common in the eastern counties as well, where we see a lot of residue can really impact emergence, can cause varying time to emergence. So we're seeing plants there of multiple different stages, some rosettes, some starting to bloom, and filling in rows differently. By not having that residue managed correctly or moved out of the seed row, that can cause singulation issues, that can cause emergence issues. But on the flip side, having significant amount of residue is critical to building soil organic matter, retaining ground cover, and reduces crusting as again, a fractionation point, something that can protrude through that soil surface. You're not going to get that thick concrete-like layer if you get those driving rains and then followed by baking sun. Residue also acts as a place for frost and flea beetles to kind of hide. The more residue on the surface, the longer it takes for soil to warm up and the longer it retains cold in the morning. By simply acting as a bit of a wind barrier, that cold air temperature can remain down the soil surface a little longer. I talked a little bit about planters, then I want to get into some of the air drill seeding equipment. So look, that picture on your screen is a wide row planter that would be common in Western Canada for corn and beans. We don't really use it much for canola, but it certainly has been done. But in this case here, we've got solid gauge wheels, rounded packing and closing wheels, which work well on the loamier soils or those with minimal residue. But as soon as you move into a higher residue or a heavier clay situation, especially on those wet years, they can tend to roll up, plug, and cause issues, pull the seed out of the furrow even. But I want to emphasize is the trash cleaners on the front. I'm sure this is done in Ontario as well, but if you're going to be putting in canola with a planter, absolutely must to have a clean seed furrow using those row cleaners ahead of planting. I can't get rid of my pointer. Okay. I wanted to show you these trash cleaners here, but I don't know if it will show up for you. So if you just give me a moment here to get rid of my pointer. Okay, I'll show you this online. How about that? Here we go. This is the video I wanted to highlight for you. What we've got here is a local agronomist in Manitoba who had a client that retrofitted one of their planting pieces of equipment, used a drill that was modified to include row cleaners. So it's not common to see trash cleaners on a seed drill. That's more of a planter thing. But just wanted to highlight that it certainly can be done and it can work quite well in a high residue situation. In this case, this farm would have been a minimal till. I don't think it would have been quite zero till, but certainly a lot of residue there. And we're seeing those row cleaners work quite well as moving the residue out of the seed row. So I'll stop there and jump back into presentation. You can still see everything okay?
Yep.
Okay. Just over half. For what they use for canola and small grain cereals would be the same. So we do see those machines being used across multiple acres, and certainly air hoe drill is favored, followed by the single disc opener, which is in the tight competition race with a flex frame air hoe drill. Just to give you a context of what we use here and how we achieve success. So to show you a quick video here of the single disc opener. Oh dear, that's fairly choppy. We can see that here. Let's stop right. right there. We'll jump ahead for a slide. The single disc opener here, we've got spoked gauge wheels, which we'll address a little bit later, really help for muddy conditions and breaking up the soil surface if we have a lot of exposed soil. It provides just a bit of a fraction point, as well as collapsing some of that sidewall trench smear we might see with a disc opener. It makes it a little bit easier for a small seeded crop like canola to break through and reach the soil surface. On the flex frame air openers, I hope this video plays a little better. Must be an internet connection. Sorry about that, everyone. We're seeing fixed shanks that don't move independently or contour with the ground, but they are followed by a series of packing gangs. So this particular farm's got RTK GPS. He's running in between standing furrow, so a zero till situation. You notice how much more residue there is in the surface, but in between those rows, that residue is a lot less. Certainly an ideal environment for canola to emerge in, but we do have to recognize that a flex frame drill with those packers riding further back and that drill only flexing on 4 or 5 points of contact doesn't have the exact same ground contouring and following as a single disc or a independent opener drill might. And as a result, we do tend to see gang drift on hills and undulations in terrain, and our packing right directly over the seed row might not be as exact as you would see otherwise. One other item I wanted to highlight was spoked gauge wheels. So you see that in the middle of the photo here. This is certainly an increasing adaptation on the prairies, particularly in the Red River Valley and on heavy clay soils or clays that tend to be, or soils that tend to be over 50% clay content. We normally have wet springs. We haven't had for the past couple of years, so it's harder to show a picture where it's in use. But those wet, soggy soils, they build up on discs, build up on machinery, and need a way of getting rid of that mud without having it impact your seed depth and your drill performance. So having those spoke wheels where that mud can accumulate behind the wheel and then push through the spokes seems to be a great way of managing that. And we are seeing improved seed beds from drills using a spoked wheel versus a solid gauge wheel. Tends to be a little more expensive to retrofit or upgrade, but certainly an investment that most farmers deem worth it. And when soils and landscapes are particularly variable, as is the case much of the prairies west of the valley, independent opener air hoe drills are preferred. Here we're seeing single wheels or single gauge / packing wheels, providing that individualized depth control for an individual shank. So we're not seeing that gang drift or varying depth as a drill moves over a landscape. We tend to have more precise control of our seed depth. Again, really important for a small seeded crop like canola, where we're targeting about 3/4 of an inch seeding depth. So it's just skipping it in the surface there, and allows that inline closing and packing. So we're not seeing that move outside of the furrow as much. Now I talked a little bit about crusting, and this is based off of some assumptions I've got about Eastern Ontario, looking at some of the Leda clays, that sort of thing in the Ottawa River Valley. Unstable clays that tend to aggregate and stick together and may not be the best seed bed, similar to some of the lacustrine deposited clays in the Red River Valley, but seemingly a little bit different in terms of organic matter and some nutrient content. So wanted to highlight some of the conditions that lead to crusting. So increased tillage certainly is a factor that leads to crusting or the risk of crusting by having more exposed soil on the surface, less residue, less organic matter. So there's more space for the soil just to gel together when we have those spur events, a heavy rainfall followed by a very hot baking sun that can coalesce and glue that soil together. Excessive packing or excessive drill contact with the soil afterward, or a heavy packer that follows, can again push those soil particles together and lead to conditions that may have crusting develop afterward. So high clay content soils, obviously more crusting. More soil organic matter can reduce that crusting percentage. So that's always an important build factor, as well as carbon sequestration. And larger particles like sand and silt have less surface area to glue to each other and then don't hold as tightly. It is worth noting that soils with higher sodium content and less calcium tend to have a higher tendency to crust. Okay. If you have a situation where you've got a crusted soil and things aren't working out well for you, and you know that your seed is germinating and growing under the surface, but not emerging, you know, 5 to 14 days later, what can you do about it? You can consider a diamond tooth harrow or very light spring tooth harrow pass going parallel with the rows. Moving perpendicular over the rows tends to rip up the seed bed more so than if you move in parallel function. But do know that you will pull some up certainly. It's not always a recommended practice. The best thing to do is wait and hope for a nice gentle rain that softens the soil surface and allows those seedlings to emerge. But that is a rescue treatment. As we see soybean acres expand in Western Canada, we see growers adopting more land rollers and land rolling equipment to push rocks and root balls back into the surface, make it easier to harvest. However, very little research has been done in terms of that impact on crusted canola. We know it has been done occasionally, but we also know that a very hard crusted soil, that firm concrete layer on the surface, can also have a very wet, soggy, or saturated soil underneath, especially if we've had those driving rains followed by baking sun. Now, running a very heavy implement like the land roller over top can compact that wet layer even further and actually make it harder yet for canola to emerge. So the jury's still out on that one. But buyer beware, I guess, if that is a practice you are considering on crusted canola. Certainly would sooner stick with more rain or a harrow pass. And obviously, last up would be breaking it up and reseeding. Now, talked about agronomics on how to achieve a decent crop in heavy clays. Now let's look a little bit more at the equipment optimization side of things. To start with, I want to really highlight this calculator from the Canola Council. It's an excellent tool. I use it all the time when I'm talking to growers or agronomists, either on my laptop or on my phone. I can pull it up very easily, and it's very helpful to start in a prepared situation before heading out to the field, making sure the drill is calibrated, making sure you know your seed size, your seeding rate, in order to make sure when you get to the field, everything's ready to go. It's not a matter of stopping and recalibrating once you're there. So start by knowing things like your seed size, your seeding rate, your logistics management, which machine is going where, and then sometimes even your equipment work rate, how many acres per hour your machine will cover, and if you're able to get what your intended canola acres are in a certain amount of time, obviously weather dependent. So I'll click on this calculator, and I want to just give you a quick walkthrough of this website if you haven't been here already. Okay. There's 6 calculators on this page. The one I want to highlight is the seeding rate and seed cost calculator in the upper left. And in this calculator, you have 3 options: seeding rate, emergence, and plant density. So going through the seeding rate one to start with. As you purchase your canola seed, you've got 1,000 seed weight on your seed bag. Ranges between 4 to about 6.5 grams. So I'm going to say 4.3 is my average seed size on that seed lot. I want to target between 5 to 7 plants per square foot. 6 is right in the middle. And what's my estimated emergence percentage to start with? If you know from previous years, you can put that number in. But if you don't, canola emergence is typically 50 to about 60% on the prairies anyway, and it is for many canola crops across Canada. Farmers often overestimate this number and think that their seed emergence percentage is closer to 80 to 90%. Sorry to tell you that is not the case. It's very rare that we see canola move past 80%, even if everything is done perfectly. So I would hazard a guess and say, especially on challenging conditions, cold soils, flea beetles, your surviving plant emergence percentage might be 55%. So let's put that number in. That spits out a seeding rate of 4.5 pounds an acre. So that's a nice, easy number to start calibrating your drill at. You can also put your seed cost in. 14 bucks a pound is about $63 an acre, $630 a bag, more or less. So it's a nice way to do that. You can also flip it around and look at your emergence percentage. Looking at your plant density, we wanted 6 plants per square foot, but say we got only 4.5 plants per square foot. Our 1,000 seed weight was 4.3, as I mentioned, and our seeding rate was 4.5 pounds an acre. Our emergence was actually only 41% when we budgeted on 55. So that's certainly something to consider for a future canola crop. or next year's season, you can put this year's numbers in and say, oh, I need to make some adjustments on my drill. I might need to slow down. I might need to do my field selection a little more carefully. But it gives you a nice validation check to see if what you were doing was correct. And then lastly, you can play around with your plant density here as well. So there's some really cool calculators. I highly recommend using it. Works great, excellent on your phone and in the field. So definitely take advantage of that. Alrighty. Back to the presentation. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about seed boot openers in clay. In loose, fine to loamy clays, having a mid-row ridge between the furrows, seed row furrows, can become a problem if you're followed by heavy rains or strong winds, those conditions that lead to crusting. So on the bottom, lower left here of your screen, you can see that based on this soil profile or this seed profile, you can see that a mid-row band has been placed to put fertilizer down with seed and starter phosphate on the sides. But those mid-row banders, or the seeding implement itself, threw up a lot of soil that sits on that mid-row band, perhaps even an inch or two above the average level where the seed could sit. Now, if you have good soil organic matter, good residue, good ground cover, or narrow row spacing, it might not be an issue. But if you're faced with those strong winds, we usually see in the prairies, or a driving rain, which I suspect might be more of a problem in Ontario, that loose clay on the surface can quickly become pulverized and move into those soil furrows, seed row furrows, and now your seed, instead of being half an inch deep, is an inch and a half deep. So that can become a real problem. So looking at what your seeder does that throws up a high ridge on a clay soil might not be as favorable as you might think it is. So it depends what you're looking for, but that structureless clay can move in and seal crust rows. So I wouldn't say this is the best tool or the best style of seeding on a heavier clay, but certainly something to consider. Now, on really tight, soggy clays that are compacted and really cold in spring, we often think they need to be warmed up, and certainly our crops can benefit from tilling or a bit of greater soil disturbance to warm up our black soils, take advantage of that solar radiation. So on the photo here in your top left, highlights a twin band, higher disturbance type of cedar. So we've got 16 inches from the edge of one seed row pass to the edge of the next row pass, 4-inch disturbance on each row, plus 8 inches in the middle. So we've got that wind barrier, that trap barrier. We're not disturbing that soil there, so it's less likely to crust or make a pancake surface if that is the case. But we are running a fairly wide seed row disturbance here. We're putting majority of our fertilizer down in a deeper band and then seed on a twin shelf on either side. Now, when you're using a shelf type opener or a winged type opener, the sides of that seed row trench can in fact actually become a little bit more compacted, especially if you're running in very wet soils where you get that sidewall trench smear. So if that's the case, that early emerging seedling isn't going to have a very strong root, but that root will grow where the path of least resistance exists, and that's going to grow into this central disturbed zone. Now, if we don't get enough rainfall, there's always a chance that new seedling root can find and start to get burnt or injured by that high or that very hot fertilizer band. So that is something to consider. That might not be the best solution overall. You might want to place your fertilizer a little further away. Or with running a very wide disturbance opener, you also have to run a very wide packer after it in order to make sure you have that good seed to soil contact. And that packer then can do exactly that, just pack that surface down and leave those 4-inch furrows a little bit more prone to crusting. So it depends on your soil situation or your residue situation, the environment you've got, but certainly something to consider. Now, as a general all-round opener, I would tend to recommend something like this on a heavier clay type soil as an all-round, all-purpose kind of opener. A sideband cedar. So we are making that shelf again, but it's only to one side rather than both. And that fertilizer again is going deeper and down, further down, following that 4R nutrient practice. So your starter P and K is in that furrow, while the bulk of the N and S is either in a mid-row band or placed prior to seeding or even after a top dress. Might be a little bit more efficient in terms of less soil disturbance if you are looking to keep some residue on the surface, and likely less prone to crusting because you're not touching or coming into contact with all that rest of that soil in between each individual seed row. Any questions that were coming up so far? I'm rocketing right along through this.
This is great. We do have one question that I don't know if it's
Sure.
super pertinent to where you're at now, but just about canola roots' ability to grow through compacted layers.
Canola roots are fairly good at exploiting cracks in the soil profile. They tend to get a lot more effective as you move past the bolting stage and flowering stage. Earlier on in the year, canola roots aren't particularly big or known to have a huge taproot. When you get later on in the season, then you're really going to find that big taproot moving down into the soil profile. And it can get down 4 to 6 feet under ideal conditions and without a hard plow pan layer. Early on in the year, not great at doing that. You got to have some robust growth on first. So that plant's got to be able to find some nutrients and find some goodies before it's going to start going down. And if we have a lot of moisture, a lot of nutrients close to the surface, that root is fairly lazy and it will try and stay close to the surface. If you're shorting it of things, water, nutrients, water in particular, then is really going to start punching down and looking for that water at greater depth.
Great, thanks. So the follow-up is then it sounds like smearing, it's important to avoid smearing at planting or with spring tillage.
It really is. Yeah. Yeah, with canola, you don't really want to smear that around, especially on a heavy clay. It's less of a concern if your soil is a little lighter, a little loamier. But on a clay soil, unless there's some really good soil structure or alternative roots for that canola root to exploit, that's why I was kind of pointing on the one. You might have sidewall trench smear on one side, but maybe a little bit less so on the other side. That root could kind of grow across and grow down. So that might be beneficial in that instance versus if you're smearing it on both sides, might not be as helpful overall. We do tend to see smearing worse with a wider shovel, a wider flat shovel, as well as double disc openers where we'd see it in the planted field. But that's what you would look at when you're planting corn. No other alternative there.
Great, thanks.
No problem. Okay, wanted to talk a little bit about closing wheels. My colleague John Hurd had taken some excellent pictures of farm equipment in practice, and this particular farmer had tried a couple different closing wheels on his single disc opener drill. So highlighted them 1, 2, and 3 here. Number 1, the Semi-Pneumatic round wheel. Now, pneumatic wheels tend to be used on lighter soils or those in a zero-till scenario where less wet soil is brought up out of the seed furrow. Otherwise, they don't clean off as nicely, and they tend to bring up clumping. Clumping can occur, and that clumping can also lift the seed right out of the trench and leaving an uneven surface or something rougher to travel on after the fact. So this closing system is most common on independent opener drills, and that's about the only spot I've ever seen it. Now, spoked wheels are a little bit more robust, or your spoked closing wheels, packing wheels. They can leave fracture lines for small seedlings to emerge. They can also help crumble that sidewall trench smearing and compaction in a little bit, providing a fracture point. And that canola, despite it being a small seed, can find a way, as long as it's close enough to the surface, to grow through that fracture line and up to the surface if that is a concern on your soils. They do tend to clean off a little bit better on a heavier wet clay. The spokes themselves facilitate mud slinging off the back, so it doesn't tend to roll up quite as easily. And the third option is usually your factory standard, steel concave wheel, rounded edge, cheapest to maintain, but also has the lowest packing force. So if you're looking for increased packing for seed to soil contact, might not be the best tool for you. You might want to move something a little further down the line. Not shown in this picture are flex flame drills, which either use a rubber or a steel wheel packer, more commonly rubber on prairies, to allow for greater flex to remove mud and to roll over rocks. Now, lastly, looking at time, how to get this seeding operation done in a hurry. I'm going to focus on it mostly from a temperature perspective, since you as farmers all know that you've got to seed as soon as you possibly can. But I'd like to highlight here how canola emergence can be affected by soil temperature. I borrowed this from the Canola Council of Canada's website, the Canola Encyclopedia, Time of Seeding. So we've got a number of different soil temperatures here. The light blue line shows canola germination at 8 degrees Celsius. The dark blue here on the opposite shows germination at a soil temperature of 2 degrees Celsius. So if you plant your canola at 2 degrees Celsius and barely above freezing, it's going to take at least 15 days to hit about 75% germination. So it takes a long time, and that's just germination. We're not even talking emergence at this point, but just germination. Versus as soon as you cross that 5-degree temperature threshold, that's between 4 and 6 here, we really see that start to rapidly improve germination. So if your soil temperature is 8 degrees, for example here, we're seeing germination today from seeding at 0 by 100% germination by day 5. So that will really help in terms of building a uniform, more robust crop that can handle intense flea beetle pressure. It can handle flowering, going into flowering a little more uniformly. It makes harvest and your spraying operations so much easier. But I guess the point goes here that seed as early as your soil conditions will allow you to. It's important to know what your soil temperatures are and take temperatures twice a day. So, I mean, anything can read 8 or 9 degrees when taken at 3 in the afternoon, but take an average. Take a temperature at 8 in the morning and one at 3 in the afternoon. Average those two and see what you're going to come up with at your seeding depth, right? So targeting about an inch depth, and then base your seeding operations on those temperatures. Waiting for that perfect temperature can also hurt your entry into the flowering window. I know Eastern Ontario can get extremely hot in the summer, just like the Red River Valley here. And as we have crops move into that flowering window in the heat of July, heat blasts can be more of a concern. So certainly, I do tend to encourage pushing canola seeding a little bit earlier. But in terms of managing flea beetles, sometimes I like to seed just after the neighbor is gone. So the flea beetles move onto their field and stay off of mine. But I'm not sure how relevant that will be in your situation.
I love that, Dane. That's great.
Well, it works great for me. I've got a neighbor who seeds half a section of canola, and I've got 80 acres across the road. I'm like, oh, he's out seeding and spraying, and 2 days later, I know I can go because by the time his canola emerges, he'll have sprayed it twice for flea beetles, and I won't have to do anything. And I know the flea beetles are there, but I think he's taking care of most of them. At least that's my own personal experience.
That's awesome. Maybe we should develop a schedule.
Yeah.
But this data is kind of interesting because so here we try to balance early planting. Like we encourage early planting because the sooner the crop gets bolted, the less issues we have with swede midge, which emerge from the soil on June 1st. But then we also, of course, deal with potentially frost or slow early growth. So I'm not sure if I have a question in there other than we have had growers that had success in June planting too, because it just grows so quickly. But I suppose you run into maturity issues in Manitoba if you plant in June.
We certainly can run into those late season frosts. I mean, we still have spring frosts occasionally as late as June 6th or 7th, something like that. Not super frequent, I guess I would say, but common enough that it occurs. It really depends on what your grower's practice is. Like, what risk are they more willing to take? Are they more willing to take a swede midge or a heat blast risk, or against a yield penalty, or would they rather try and avoid some of the flea beetles earlier on in the season? Or do they have other crops that they're looking to focus on? If canola is their main bread and butter, then I would say probably putting it a little earlier will help you with your yield goal overall, despite some drawbacks than waiting too late. Actually, I have a question for the audience. Now, I know we're talking mostly about spring canola here. Is winter canola an option in Eastern Ontario, or is it a little bit too risky in terms of winter kill?
Yeah, in Eastern Ontario, we're just kind of evaluating that now. We have some plots out on planting date. I think on the clay soils in like Renfrew County, that's going to be a real struggle for winter canola. And we have a lot of growers on the call from the Northeast, and I definitely do not recommend winter canola for those growers.
Right.
But since we were talking about it, just if anyone on the call wants to speak up about this planting date and balancing, timing of planting and swede midge and frost, we'd love to hear from you. I'm putting people on the spot, but
by all means, expose my ignorance here. I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with the Ontario growing conditions as we've got in the prairies here, but feel free to speak up if I said something wrong or different to what your practice might be.
No worries. Well, we'll let people. You can go on, and if someone wants to throw a question in the chat, we'll address it.
Sure. So I talked about frost a little bit. Canola is reasonably frost tolerant if it's hardened off, meaning preceding couple days have very cold temperatures just above zero. So that preceding with those cold temperatures, if you get a -2 frost, that canola can handle it for up to 2 hours. As the temperature gets colder, the duration gets longer, that likelihood of frost survival isn't as great. But the risk of frost damage increases with loose soils with lots of airspace. So if you've got a very fluffy soil or a lot of clay soil that's been recently disturbed, there's a lot of airspace or pore space there. So that cold air can then seep into those top few millimeters of soil. And if you have a germinating canola that's just under the surface, it may be impacted. So it's just something to consider. And heavy residue. Lots of residue means less black soil, which means that it warms up slower in the morning, and the cold air can get trapped in that stubble closer down to the surface. So that may exacerbate a frost a little bit more than if you had a blacker soil. So pros and cons, both sides. When to assess frost damage: 24 hours after a frost, look at the hilltops, the valleys, your flat spots, areas with more or less trash cover, compare and see how they did. Flag your individual plants for something that you might want to come back to and use as your benchmark or bellwether plant. 72 hours or 3 days later, reassess those same areas for damage, compare and contrast. Your frost may not have impacted your entire field, might be restricted to a certain zone. And 3 to 5 days, then now do look at those plant stand counts, look closely for that growing point and that new growth tissue. So the photo here we've got is under ideal conditions, that canola plant should put on some new growth from that regrowth point if it wasn't affected by frost. And we're seeing those new green leaves coming out of that growth point. So we're seeing that this plant would survive. And if most of your field looks like that, then it's probably better off waiting and keeping that crop in rather than destroying and trying again. So when you're assessing, do dig the plants out of the ground. Look for that the stem is not pinched off and restricting nutrients to new growth. Seedling is not floppy or flaccid. We're seeing that wet, water-soaked plant, meaning the cytoplasm in the water is bleeding out of the plant and the cells have been ruptured. So that plant is unlikely to recover if that is the case. But do determine plant stands. You want a minimum of 4 plants per square foot. I know we were targeting 5 to 7 to start with. Anything less than 4, we do tend to see yield drop off fairly substantially if other conditions aren't favorable. But if you do have good growing conditions, good weed control, everything kind of goes your way the rest of the year, you can get away with as low as 1 to 2 plants per square foot on some of the modern canola hybrids. They do compensate very well, but we do have to have the conditions that allows for that. Again, just a bit of a photo here. You can kind of see the color differentiation. Some of these canola cotyledons look very light yellow or light green, pardon me, not vibrant. So they've certainly been frost injured. Some of them will look a little darker, so they might be water soaked, but those pale ones are drying down, likely not to survive. However, I think this picture was taken out of a seed spill on a field. It might not be indicative of the whole entire field. Now, lastly, wanted to talk about heat blast. That came up a couple times, and based on some of the information Megan shared with me, midsummers in the eastern counties can certainly get very, very hot. We saw, if I averaged the last 3 years at Ottawa, there were 25 days in summer that reached temperatures above 29 degrees Celsius. So I'll address why that's important in a second. Now, when we're talking about heat blast, there's a formula to actually determine the amount of heat or yield lost, due to excessive heat and heat stress at flowering specifically. So Dr. Malcolm Morrison at Ag Canada in Ottawa developed this here. It's the heat index. It's the sum of your daily maximum temperature. Sorry, let me pull my pointer up. Daily maximum temperature minus your fixed temperature, the fixed temperature at which canola can no longer compensate for the high temperature, and then just sum that up over the number of days. So say you had a daytime high of 33 degrees Celsius, but your daytime injury point for threshold for canola is 29.5 during the day. So that's what the sunshine's here for. Above that temperature, canola is stressed. It cannot compensate for that extreme heat. It starts producing an imbalance of hormones that can lead to yield loss, pollen sterility. We see pollen not being as potent, I guess, as it were, and not setting as much seed. Now we add the nighttime portion of it. So it's a 24-hour period. Say the nighttime overnight low only went as low as 22 degrees Celsius. It needs to drop below 17 C in order to have that, allow that plant time to recover and recuperate from those extremely hot daytime temperatures, to translocate water to upper leaves, reopen those stomata, release that carbon dioxide, take in oxygen in order to continue growing. If it doesn't have those refreshing conditions and those cool overnight temperatures, we can actually see more heat blast occur overnight than we can find during the day, just due to the lower overall threshold at night. So if I add up those heat blast unit index numbers, 33 minus 29.5 is 3.5, and over my overnight HBI is 5, add them together, 8.5 heat blast units per 24-hour period. And based on research too, we see that there's about a 4% yield loss per heat blast unit. So just certainly something to consider. I threw that Ottawa number in here just to give you a formula to run through. So if I assume that all 25 days that were on average above 29 degrees all occurred during that flowering window, they may not, but if they all did, 8.5 heat blast units a day, say that's standard, and say we have these temperatures all the time, times 4% as a decimal, gives me 0.34 of a yield loss per day. So per 24-hour period over a 29.5 degree day and a 17 degree night, times 25 days per year in that bloom period, leads to an 8.5% yield loss due to heat alone and no other factor. So we're not counting Swede midge, we're not counting weed competition, lack of moisture, those other effects. So certainly can be impactful. There's just something to keep in mind in terms of seeding and perhaps selecting varieties that have a shorter maturation window. We certainly can see a wider difference in canola maturity, 10, 15 days between the earliest and latest maturing variety. So sometimes it may be more advantageous to seed an earlier maturing spring canola just to try and get ahead of that flowering window. We do tend to see flowering start at about 525 growing degree days, if that's something you're tracking. Now that's all I've got on heat blast and some agronomic tips for managing on heavy clays. Love to hear your thoughts and spur some discussion, and hopefully this provides some input for your own farms to see what you may want to do or are already considering.
Awesome. Thank you, Dane. While we're on this slide, so 25 days in the last 3 years on average above, wow, I said that weird. 25 days above 29C in Ottawa on average. Earlton was 14 days above 29C for those of you in that area that are listening. And Wyerton was about 8.5 on average. So we still do have a little bit of heat in Earlton in recent years, which is up in the Northeast, Dane.
Okay.
Okay. So on seeding topics, Terry Phillips has a question. Lots of our smaller acre growers are using box drills, either through grass seed boxes or bulked up with MAP in the grain box. Any experience with other products for bulking up, like corncob grits or elemental sulfur prills?
Actually, no. It's very rare that seed in Western Canada will be bulked up in any way. I know growers occasionally might use, say, an open pollinated hybrid to bulk it up a little bit to provide some more volume. So they're seeding their herbicide tolerant as one rate, and then throwing in some OP canola that is then sprayed out or acts as flea beetle bait. Not very commonly done. Certainly, MAP would be more common, but most of the box drills that I'm aware of have largely been sold or they've been scrapped. So it's not a widely done practice, I would say, these days. So I can't really give you any real good advice on that one. Sorry.
That's interesting, though, the open pollinated varieties. I never would have thought of that. Terry,
Yeah.
did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, it's just it's a common sort of issue. You know, guys under 200 acres of canola, it's hard to justify buying an air drill.
Yeah. No,
if they're growing beans or whatever else with the box drill.
Yeah, that's right. No, it totally makes sense. I mean, it certainly does get expensive with the way canola seed is going these days. There are some varieties that might be a little cheaper if you're looking at a Clearfield tolerant versus one of the TrueFlex or Liberty tolerant canolas. There sometimes can be some cost advantages there. We do see growers trying to reduce seeding rate fairly frequently, which is why I mentioned planters. That's become a little bit more common in central Manitoba and the number 2 corridor in Alberta, using wide row spacing and seeding canola at 2 to 3 pounds an acre with a planter on a 15-inch row or a 22-inch row. It works amazingly well in terms of emergence. We're getting a much more uniformly emerging crop, but then we tend to have a longer flowering period, and we tend to have a delayed harvest as a result. Yield usually is about the same, or it's not statistically different in any way, but causes some issues with agronomic management. Because there's so few plants there to begin with, you have any kind of situation that causes a yield loss, you're losing sleep at night. You've got to check that field every other day, at least for flea beetles or weed competition, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we actually are seeing a lot of the southern Ontario growers seed their winter canola with planters. And not everybody, it's not super straightforward. I think there are some challenges with getting their corn planters to put down canola seed. But then, in some, say in Essex County, there's one grower that's seeding for a few different growers, getting it hired out. So that's kind of interesting. Terry, while we have your attention, someone asked, what is the shortest maturity available in spring canola varieties? And I'm bugging you because here in Ontario, Dane, we only have a handful of varieties that are available to us. So,
okay.
I think on Invigor would be 233, L233P. On some of the Roundup varieties, we've got some earlier stuff, some of the DeKalb stuff, but we don't use a lot of Roundup varieties anymore with the Roundup Ready beans in rotation.
yeah.
But I would say those would probably be a little shorter. They're not quite back to the Polish levels, but kind of in between.
Excellent, thanks. Keith, I'm going to pick on you. So back to the bulking up canola. Did you want to say what you were typing in the chat here, or would you mind?
Yeah, so you're right. Most of the hoe drills or box drills or double disc drills that we used to use on canola have been parked or sold. But it was pretty common, especially when you had a drill, you set the width of a dime or the width of a quarter to try to get 6 pounds of canola seed out of it to mix in and 50 pounds to the acre of 1152 to meter out instead of 5 pounds, 55 pounds. So, and growers did that with pretty good success, but it was pretty bulky, and they didn't really want to get stuck with mixed seed fertilizer on their truck if it rained, that sort of concern. So it's easy enough to do. It works well, but it's a little bit awkward, and growers really moved away from it.
Yeah, I might add too, if you're looking at blending off your product, maybe better off broadcasting your seed in. I mean, it's certainly not a recommended practice, but if you're in a pinch for time, or you're in a pinch with really, really wet soils and no other way to get that product on, and you have a high rate of phosphate, I mean, 55 pounds in a narrow, very, half an inch opener on a disc drill or a box drill can really burn your seed. So perhaps broadcasting that in shallow incorporation with a harrow or some sort of vertical till pass may be what you might look at if your soils are super wet and waterlogged. Otherwise, definitely try and plant it in the furrow normally.
Yeah, you're looking at a safe rate of 15 to 20 pounds of actual phosphorus. So you're looking somewhere in the range of 40 pounds. That would be a safe rate. We do have I won't say a fair number, but we have a noticeable amount of floating or broadcast seeding of canola in my territory. I'm right up against the foothills in Alberta. And my experience has been that we have very few disasters or wrecks with seeding establishment with air seeders or typical seeding implements. Like I said, we have very few of those, but we have probably twice as many wrecks with the floated on or broadcast seeding. Increasing your seeding rate is often a good idea, but generally, if they're floating canola, they're floating it because they have too wet of conditions, so they tend to get away with it. But yeah, it's not just not as reliable, so I discourage it if I can.
Yeah, exactly what Keith said. So it's a last resort kind of option if you have nothing else to work with.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Keith. Okay, any other questions for Dane? I'll throw a conversation starter out there. I know Manitoba is likely more dry than what we are here. And and maybe that's one of the reasons that we're doing more tillage. So why are our growers doing more tillage, and what would be our particular challenges with no-till? That's not necessarily a question for Dane, but for those growers and agronomists on the call. Could we move to a more reduced till scenario and banding of fertilizer?
One of the nicest things I've seen with, going like, so we're pretty much all no-till at home, and a few of my growers around me are playing closer to no-till now than ever. Depth control is awesome, because guys that are working ground, a lot of cases too deep, fluffing it up like crazy to warm it up, and then really struggle. Like, we actually have guys roll ground before they plant to try to firm it back up for depth control. So it's kind of counterintuitive that, you make 2 extra passes, tear it up, pack it back instead of getting seed in the ground. So I don't really think, with canola being such a fine, the trash thing is definitely an issue, but the depth control on canola seems way more important. Like, since we've been no-tilling, we have the most emergent, or the most even emergence that we've ever seen, and it really helps when you come to spraying and fungicides and everything else.
That's awesome to hear, Terry, that you're having a good experience. So, and would you say you're in the minority with no-till in your area?
We're turning the tide a little bit. Like I say, a couple of my neighbors, pretty large acre, lot more acres than me on canola on a typical year, and they're pretty much no-till, because especially as we're selling a lot of the straw, the cereals, and the rotation, there's not a lot of trash left on those. If you chop a heavy crop of spring wheat, yeah, there's definitely issues. We've run into them too. But as long as we're selling straw at good prices, it's a lot easier to no-till canola into.
Awesome. And do you, Terry, or even Dane, have issues with slugs? Like, I've seen a lot of, for sure we see it in winter canola, but in Bruce Gray kind of area, I've seen no-till spring canola be kind of destroyed by slugs. Do you guys see that, Terry?
Not yet at home. I had a couple of guys north of me that had issues with slugs in the past, but we've been fortunate, knock on wood, hasn't been an issue yet.
The same here. I mean, there's some advantages to living where it's cold in winter 9 months of the year. A lot of things don't survive here, and I think slugs would be one of them. They don't really stick around. We would have some issues with root maggots occasionally on canola that's on fairly tight rotation, or loamier soils that have a lot of corn or beans on them. They aren't usually problematic for the most part, but they can spur root disease.
And I assume dry springs too. If you have dry conditions, there'd be a lot fewer slugs. You make me think of, I went on a canoeing trip in the Yukon once, and there was just no bugs or toads or anything, because all that winter kills them. No mosquitoes, no.
Oh, you must have got lucky. I've heard they're pretty big up there too sometimes.
Okay, really looking for any other questions from the group. Please feel free to speak up or type something in the chat. We did see some frost in the Northeast in 2021, and I know there were a lot of acres reseeded, but I think in that case, it wasn't necessarily a problem of not being sure whether the canola was alive or not. I'm pretty sure it was just straight up dead. Any comments from the Northeast on encounters with frost? Quiet group today.
We were -6, -7. So
oof, yeah.
After really a month of really exceptionally early warm weather. So yeah, canola was pretty much, it was an easy, well, I guess the challenge was getting seed. We had no problem determining the need, just getting seed in place from the west.
Right, very good. I think Sebastian put a question in here. I'm just going to read it. Assuming most Ontario growers have disc openers, what seeder row unit modifications would they consider to improve seeding and emergence? How much difference would they see with better row cleaner or closing wheel selection? Is it worth the cost? Did you catch my question, Dane?
Oh, sorry, that was directed to me. I thought it was more for your Ontario growers.
Well, I
was
mean,
thinking about it. I'm like, yeah, I have a response here.
please go ahead.
Yes. Is it worth the cost? I haven't priced this equipment out recently, or how many row units your seeders might be working with. If you're working with something small, 30-foot wide unit, it may be advantageous, or it may just be more advantageous to deal with your residue more effectively at harvest time on the preceding crop, dealing with a chopping header or something that stomps the stalks down, something that can deal with sizing some of that residue a little more effectively while still leaving some on the surface. Might be more bang for your buck than putting on row cleaners specifically, unless you are seeding a sizable acreage of canola. If you're doing 200 acres a year, no, it's not going to pay. But at that point, it may be worth your while to dedicate a canola seeding machine in the neighborhood, sharing that cost with some of the neighbors and saying, this is what we're going to use to seed canola. We only seed 1,500 acres of canola in a year in this entire district or county. If that machine is passed around with decent biosecurity, then getting that acreage seeded in a couple of days shouldn't really be a problem, and that might be more of an effective use of sharing labor and expenses.
Awesome, thanks. Anything else? I'm kind of run out of questions. I am not an equipment specialist. That's why I hired the big guns to come in here. Terry said, Dane, could you put the link in the chat for the trash whippers? Oh, was that the Twitter video, or? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the Twitter video.
Oh, yeah. Here, I'll type it in for you. The link didn't work for me either, but if you just search him on Twitter, Troy Turner is his name. He is an agronomist with Field to Field Agronomy, a local independent company out of Carmen, Manitoba. And if you search that name, you will find his video just a little bit down. Or if you even search the hashtag plant21, I believe it comes up fairly quickly.
Are there a lot of growers, like aside from the winter canola growers, I don't think I've seen anyone using like planters. I don't know if anyone else on the chat has seen that. I know it has, it has advantages in terms of, yeah, I've seen even down to 2 pounds of seed per acre in winter canola, and it lets the plants get nice and big before winter, which is nice in that crop, because there's a lot of space there. The plants are spaced out, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for some reduced seeding rates. Sorry, someone's.
And so thank goodness the Zoom comes through on my phone.
You're talking twice.
Yeah.
Well, someone's talking, but I don't know if they're talking to us or each other.
John Hurd, do you have something to add?
No, just my ineptitude at this virtual social learning. So I'll tune out here.
Oh, good.
I was just going to say we have 2 Pottinger drills, one in Verner and one in Quebec, just across from us, and they're really doing a nice job at that 2 to 3 pounds of seed.
Yeah, that can really shave some costs. And the stands look awesome in the winter canola, like really nice and even. And as Dane said, really high rates of emergence. I know with some of the growers have had issues like with the seed not reading in the seed tubes, and that they don't know how much seed they're putting down, and different like problems with the equipment.
Yeah, that can be an issue. I mean, it's not for everyone. I mean, you can't retrofit an old planter to plant canola effectively. You've got to have some pretty top of the line stuff to begin with, because what you're saving in those 2 or 3 pounds an acre you're trying to save, you could easily be giving up by having seed leak out of an improperly sealed vacuum seal, something not calibrated correctly, bumpy fields where your singulation doesn't happen and everything gets jiggled out for a small seed, really got to watch that. Or if you have your vacuum even turned too high, you're running on inches mercury here, you'd run around 3 to 5 inches mercury on the gauge for a vacuum planter for canola, versus corn, you might be running more like 12 or 14. So there's certainly costs to do that. It would cost, depending on what brand of manufacturing equipment you would go with, but it could be anywhere between $150 to about $400 a row unit to convert a planter over just to do canola. So that's not counting downforce or any of those more advanced technologies. This is just getting the plate, a buffer strip, and an ejector wheel, because you actually need a little physical wheel poking the seed out of the vacuum holes, because sometimes the vacuum doesn't let go well enough and the seed builds up static. So that's the other thing you have to watch for.
Yeah, when we did plots, we spread talc on the plates to try to help with that maybe static issue. I don't know if it worked or not, but, and also are there different brands? We used Red River Valley plates, and that spoked wheel, sometimes it wasn't running perfectly, and then all of the spokes were bent so then they're not going to be effective at poking the seed out of the hole. I don't know. Are there other options? Or I guess a brush doesn't really work because the seed's so small.
So Megan, I'm not a planter expert, but I am following it with some interest. I've got 2 miles down the road that's 15 years ago took a 60-foot planter and cut it down to 40 for his canola. And he does a good job of nice looking fields with it. We've got some interest in planters. Obviously there's some savings, cost savings on cost of seed, but a lot of that seems to be invested right back into iron. So you want to make sure you're making a decision that moves you ahead. One of the neat things that might be on the market and available or worth trying, I haven't got a price on it yet, but Syngenta is offering a Pelleta product, which is a sized canola seed. So it's a clay. I'm going to use the word clay. It's built up with a filler, so the seed is completely uniform. And the grower that I spoke with that trialed it last year indicated he was getting an extra mile an hour out of his planter with no issues on efficiency and accuracy with the planter. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, and making your seed perfectly round and smooth and a little larger than it used to be is one of the things they're trying. And you can buy that from Canterra. They've got limited availability this year.
Right. Interesting. Well, still hoping that some people have questions here. I don't like to force conversation to go on too long if people aren't interested. I'm not sure, do we have anyone from Eastern Ontario on the call that wanted to talk about anything specific to clay soils and seeding canola? Don't think so. I don't recognize any names from the East. Okay. It's a quiet day, I guess.
Good. Well, I shared my contact information on the ending slide of the PowerPoint there. So if anybody has any questions you'd like to shoot, feel free. But Megan is your canola gal for Ontario, so I think she's got this all covered. So thank you very much for inviting me, Megan. And look forward to seeing you back again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can put you guys in touch with Dane. Dane will be much more useful in terms of seeding equipment details than I will. So let me know if you want to get. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that. I'll hang on the line for a couple minutes, but you guys are disconnected, but really looking forward to having you on next week to talk about winter canola and specifically fertility in winter canola, which is something we don't have a lot of research on in Ontario. So looking forward to having some people overseas tell us how they manage that crop. Thanks again, Dane. Appreciate it.
Take care.